Chris Harrington thought the hardest part would be confirming his suspicions, but nothing could prepare him for the depths of betrayal revealed by Donovan's investigation. The photos of Amy and Mike, the incriminating messages, and the hidden rendezvous painted a devastating picture. Sitting alone in his car, Chris stared at the evidence, his mind reeling. A single question echoed louder than the rest. Why? When confronted, Amy's deflections and denial only deepened the chasm between them, forcing Chris to face the painful reality. This wasn't just the end of their marriage, but the shattering of the life he thought he knew. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter. Chris Harrington had always prided himself on being attentive, but it wasn't until subtle changes began to appear in Amy's behavior that his instincts signaled something was wrong. She had grown more distant, her once effortless warmth replaced by an almost mechanical politeness. Small but noticeable shifts marked their interactions: excuses about work obligations, late nights at the office, and an unfamiliar nervous energy when she was at home. Even their intimacy, once steady and comforting, had changed. Amy became uncharacteristically adventurous, a stark contrast to her usually reserved nature. While some might have welcomed this, to Chris, it felt like a performance, one devoid of genuine connection. At first, Chris dismissed his suspicions as paranoia, convincing himself that Amy's stress from work might be the root of her unusual behavior. He attempted to communicate, asking gentle questions about her well-being, but her answers were vague and unconvincing. Then there were the small inconsistencies, unexplained expenses that ended abruptly when he entered the room, and a new perfume he had never known her to wear. Each detail, though minor on its own, wove together a picture he couldn't ignore. Driven by a growing unease, Chris decided to take a step he never thought he'd consider. After weeks of internal turmoil, he contacted a private investigator. The decision was gut-wrenching. It felt like a betrayal of the trust he once believed was unshakable. Yet, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something critical was being kept from him. Meeting with the investigator, a man named Donovan with a reputation for discretion, Chris laid out his concerns, his voice trembling as he detailed the changes he had observed. The following weeks were a blur of anxiety and dread. Donovan provided updates, each one inching closer to confirming Chris's fears. Chris couldn't focus on anything else. Nights stretched endlessly as he lay awake, replaying moments from the past, questioning what he had missed and where things had gone wrong. He oscillated between hoping he was wrong and fearing he was right, a mental tug-of-war that left him emotionally drained. Then the call came. Donovan's voice, calm and professional, delivered the confirmation Chris had been dreading. Amy was having an affair with her colleague, Mike Brooks. The details were sparse but damning. Photos of their meetings at a house listed for sale, messages exchanged between the two, and evidence of planned rendezvous. Chris sat frozen, the words echoing in his mind. A mix of rage, heartbreak, and betrayal coursed through him, making it hard to breathe. His hands shook as he ended the call, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his chest. The reality of Amy's infidelity hit him in waves. At first, there was disbelief, a desperate desire to find an explanation that made this anything but what it was. Then came anger, sharp and consuming, directed not only at Amy but at himself for failing to see it sooner. Finally, there was sadness, deep, hollow, and pervasive, washing over him as he rarely ever built with Amy was irreparably altered. Despite the overwhelming emotions, Chris forced himself to remain composed. He knew confronting Amy without a plan would lead to chaos. Instead, he reviewed the investigator's findings, meticulously organizing his thoughts. If their marriage was going to end, it wouldn't be on a note of reckless confrontation, but with clarity and purpose. Still, in the quiet moments between his resolve, the pain lingered. The betrayal wasn't just about Amy's actions, but the trust she had shattered, the family she had endangered, and the love she had devalued. Chris couldn't help but wonder how long she had felt disconnected. and why she hadn't come to him instead of seeking solace elsewhere. This discovery marked a turning point, not just in Chris's marriage, but in his life. It was the moment he realized that while love and trust are fragile, resilience is not. He would face what lay ahead, armed with the truth and a determination to rebuild, even if it meant starting over alone. With the truth now undeniable, Chris took a deep breath and prepared for the inevitable confrontation, knowing that the journey ahead would be painful but necessary. The road to recovery had begun, even as the scars of betrayal remained fresh. The confrontation began in the quiet tension of their living room, where the late afternoon sunlight filtered through drawn curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Chris stood near the fireplace, the investigator's report in hand, his heart pounding with a mix of anger, hurt, and determination. Amy sat on the edge of the couch, her posture tense but defensive, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I need to know the truth," Chris began, his voice steady but laced with pain. "I know about you and Mike. I have proof." Amy's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and, for a fleeting moment, fear. "What are you talking about?" she replied, her tone defensive and incredulous. "Mike is just a colleague. This is ridiculous, Chris." Chris took a deep breath, holding back the wave of emotion threatening to break through. He laid the report on the coffee table and slid it toward her. "Read it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Then tell me again that I'm imagining things." Amy hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder, before pulling back. "I don't need to read this," she said, her tone sharp. "Whatever it is, it's a misunderstanding. How could you even think I'd do something like this?" "That's what I want to understand," Chris shot back, his composure beginning to crack. "How could you? After everything we've built, after all these years, why?" Amy stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger and defensiveness. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she snapped. "Are you really going to trust some stranger's word over mine? This so-called proof could be anything. It doesn't mean what you think it does." Her words only fueled Chris's frustration. "Stop deflecting, Amy," he said, his voice rising. "This isn't about what I think. It's about what you've done. I've been living with these suspicions for weeks, trying to give you the benefit of the doubt, trying to believe in you. And now this is what I get for trusting you? Don't?" Amy's expression hardened, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "I don't have to stand here and take this," she said coldly. "You've already decided I'm guilty, so what's the point of even talking?" Her words hit Chris like a blow, the sheer audacity of her denial leaving him momentarily speechless. He had expected excuses, perhaps even an apology, but not this outright rejection of accountability. "The point," he said after a moment, his voice quieter but no less intense, "is that I deserve honesty. I deserve respect, and right now you're giving me neither." Amy turned away, her shoulders trembling slightly. "I can't do this," she muttered, her voice breaking. "You're attacking me, accusing me of things I haven't done." "Don't lie to me, Amy," Chris interrupted, his tone sharp. "I've seen the photos. I've read the messages. This isn't an accusation, it's a fact." The room fell silent, the weight of Chris's words hanging heavy in the air. Amy sank back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, Chris thought she might finally admit the truth, but when she spoke, her voice was small and defensive. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. Chris felt a surge of both anger and despair. "Then what is it?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Explain it to me. Make me understand." But Amy didn't answer. Instead, she sat in silence, her refusal to acknowledge her actions leaving Chris feeling more alone than ever. In the days that followed, Chris replayed the confrontation in his mind, searching for signs of remorse or regret in Amy's words, and finding none. Her denial, her deflection, and her silence spoke louder than any confession. It was clear she wasn't ready or willing to face the consequences of her actions. As Chris sat alone that evening, the quiet of the house amplifying his thoughts, he realized that the path forward would be one he'd have to walk alone. Amy's refusal to take responsibility left him with no choice but to let go of the life they had once shared, even as the pain of her betrayal lingered. Chris arrived at the small corner cafe where he often met Stacy for quick work discussions. This time, however, it was personal. Sitting across from her at their usual booth, he felt a mix of relief and vulnerability. Stacy had always been a steady presence in his life, her practicality and sharp wit a source of comfort. But today, he needed more than casual banter. He needed someone who understood the storm he was weathering. As he recounted the events of the past weeks, Chris's voice faltered. "I don't know how I let it get this far," he admitted, staring into his untouched coffee. "I thought we were solid, and now everything feels like a lie." Stacy listened intently, her eyes softening as she leaned forward. "Chris," she began gently, "first of all, stop blaming yourself. Infidelity isn't something you caused. It's a choice she made. A terrible one." Her words were a balm to his fractured self-esteem. But the wounds ran deep. "I can't stop replaying it all," Chris confessed. "Every late night, every excuse. It feels like I missed something obvious. I trusted her, Stacy." Stacy sighed, her expression pained. Trust is what makes a relationship work. And when someone abuses that trust, it breaks you in ways you can't imagine until it happens. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been there, Chris. You know my story." He nodded. Stacy's ex-husband had cheated on her years ago, a fact she rarely spoke of. When she did, it was with a calmness that belied the chaos she must have endured. Now, her experience gave her the wisdom Chris so desperately needed. "You're going to feel a lot of things," Stacy said, her voice steady. "Anger, betrayal, sadness, and that's okay. Feel it all. But don't let it define you. You're not just the man whose wife cheated. You're Chris, a father, a friend, and one of the most decent people I know." Her words hung in the air, and Chris felt a small flicker of hope amidst the darkness. "I don't know what to do next," he admitted. "Everywhere I look, our house, our memories, it all feels tainted." Stacy reached into her bag and pulled out a set of keys. "Take some time away," she said, placing them on the table between them. "This is for my family's cottage by the lake. It's quiet, peaceful, and exactly what you need right now. No reminders of what's happened, just space to think." Chris hesitated. "I can't impose." "You're not imposing," Stacy interrupted firmly. "If anyone deserves a break, it's you. Go, clear your head. When you're ready to face everything, you'll do it with a clearer mind." He picked up the keys, gratitude welling up inside him. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Stacy smiled, her eyes glinting with a mix of determination and compassion. "You'd figure it out eventually," she said. "But I'm here to make sure you don't have to do it alone." As Chris left the cafe, he felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. Stacy's kindness and practicality had given him a lifeline, a chance to step back and begin piecing himself together. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wouldn't face it entirely alone. And that, for now, was enough. Chris sat at a quiet corner table in the student union of the University of Connecticut, nervously twisting his wedding ring. Julie and Kate arrived moments later, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. As they sat down, Julie immediately asked, "Dad, what's going on? Mom's been calling nonstop and we know something's wrong." Chris took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I need to talk to you both about something difficult," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your mother and we're getting a divorce." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither daughter spoke. Julie, the more outspoken of the two, leaned forward, her voice rising. "What? Why? What's happened? You two seemed fine." Kate, quieter but no less affected, stared at her father, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad," she whispered, "this can't be real. Are you serious?" Chris nodded, his throat tightening as he continued. I didn't want to tell you this, but you deserve the truth. Your mother, she's been unfaithful. I have proof." Julie recoiled as though she'd been struck. "Unfaithful?" she said, her voice trembling with both anger and hurt. "Are you saying Mom cheated on you? On us?" Kate's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How could she do that?" she choked out. "How could she betray you? Betray all of us?" Chris reached out, but both girls pulled back, overwhelmed by their emotions. "I know this is a lot," he said softly. "I didn't want you to find out this way, but I needed you to understand why this is happening." Julie's expression hardened. "She ruined everything," she said bitterly. "Our family, our home. How could she throw it all away?" Chris's own heartbreak deepened as he watched his daughters grapple with the news. "I know you're angry," he said. "I am too. But I need you to remember, she's still your mother. She loves you, and nothing about that has changed." Kate wiped her tears, her voice barely a whisper. "But everything else has," she said. Julie stood abruptly. "I need time, Dad. I just can't deal with this right now." As the girls walked away, Chris felt the weight of their pain, knowing it was a burden they would carry together, but also one they would all have to confront in their own time. The fracture in their family was undeniable, yet somewhere in the depths of his sorrow, Chris held on to the hope that they could begin to heal. Chris sat at the kitchen table in Frank and Eileen's home, the air thick with unspoken tension. A fresh pot of coffee steamed on the counter, but no one moved to pour a cup. Eileen's hands trembled as she clasped them together on the table, her face etched with worry. Frank leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression unreadable, but his jaw clenched. Chris broke the silence, his voice steady but strained. "I didn't want to bring this to you, but you deserve to know. Amy's been having an affair with her colleague, Mike Brooks. I've already spoken to a lawyer and started the process for divorce." Eileen gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "There must be some mistake, Chris. Amy wouldn't. She couldn't." Frank's expression darkened, his voice sharp. "Is this true? Do you have proof?" Chris nodded and slid a folder across the table. "I do. Photos, messages, everything. I'm sorry to have to show you this, but you need to understand what's happening." Eileen hesitated, her trembling hands hovering over the folder. Frank, however, grabbed it and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents. With each page, his face grew grimmer, his breathing heavier. Finally, he closed it and looked directly at Chris. "She's my daughter," he said, his voice low and taut. "But this is indefensible." Eileen's tears spilled over and she clutched Frank's arm. "Frank, don't say that," she pleaded. "We don't know what drove her to this. Maybe there's a reason, a mistake, a way to fix this." Frank shook his head, his voice firm. "A reason? Eileen, there's no excuse for this. She betrayed her husband, her family. She broke every vow she ever made." Eileen turned to Chris, her expression desperate. "Chris, please, isn't there any way you can forgive her? You've been married for 25 years. You have to try. Please, for the girls." Chris's heart ached at her plea, but he shook his head. "I've given her everything, Eileen. Love, trust, support, and she chose to throw it away. I can't rebuild what she destroyed." The room fell silent, the weight of the situation settling over them. Finally, Frank spoke, his voice softer but no less resolute. "We'll support you, Chris, whatever you decide. But this will take time for all of us to process." Chris nodded, gratitude and sadness intertwining. "I understand. And I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this." As he left their home, Chris felt the heavy burden of their shared pain, knowing that the fracture Amy's actions had caused extended far beyond just their marriage. The path forward would be difficult for everyone. Chris approached the picnic table in Willowbrook Park, where Lucy Brooks sat waiting. Her usual warm, motherly demeanor was gone, replaced by a tense stillness. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she clutched a tissue tightly in her hand. As Chris sat across from her, the weight of their shared pain filled the space between them. "I guess you know why I'm here," Chris began softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Lucy nodded but didn't look up. "I've suspected for weeks," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to believe it." Yeah, he said in acquiescence. We all said. Chris slid a small folder across the table, much like he had done with Amy's parents. "This is everything I have," he said. "I wanted you to see it before I take the next steps." Lucy hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. "I don't think I need to look," she said, her voice trembling. "But I should. For closure." She opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the damning photos and messages. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her expression hardened. "He always thought he was so clever," she murmured, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But he's predictable. Always looking for someone to feed his ego." Chris nodded, his heart heavy. "I know the feeling. I've been asking myself how I didn't see this coming. How I trusted her so blindly." Lucy finally met his eyes, her gaze filled with both sorrow and determination. "Because we loved them," she said simply. "We gave them everything, and we trusted them to do the same." For a moment, the two sat in silence, their shared pain creating an unspoken bond. Then Lucy straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. "This isn't the first time Mike's betrayed me," she admitted. "I forgave him before, for the sake of our kids. But this is different. I can't stay with someone who keeps choosing to hurt me." Chris watched her, admiring the quiet strength beneath her grief. "What will you do?" he asked. Lucy looked out at the park, her expression resolute. "I'll leave him," she said firmly. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'll figure it out. For myself and for my kids." Her words resonated deeply with Chris, who saw in Lucy a reflection of his own journey, a mix of heartbreak and resolve. As they parted ways, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by Lucy's determination to move forward despite the pain. Their paths, though separate, were bound by the same commitment to reclaim their lives from the wreckage left behind. Chris walked into the upscale cafe where Mary Beth and Phil were waiting, their confident smiles faltering the moment they saw his expression. He sat down across from them, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of calm determination. The tension in the air was palpable. "I'm going to get straight to the point," Chris began, his tone cold and firm. "I know about your involvement in Amy's affair with Mike. I've seen the texts, the advice you gave her, and your encouragement to pursue this disgrace." Mary Beth opened her mouth to protest, but Chris raised a hand to silence her. "Don't bother denying it," he said sharply. "You've both spent years treating marriage like a joke, dragging others into your twisted world. But this time, you crossed a line. My line." Phil shifted uncomfortably, but Mary Beth attempted to regain control. "Chris, you're blowing this out of proportion." "No," Chris interrupted, his voice like steel. "You helped destroy a 25-year marriage. You encouraged my wife to betray her family, and I won't let you walk away from this without consequences." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on theirs. "I've drafted a letter detailing everything. Your open marriage, your involvement in Amy's choices, all of it. It's ready to be sent to your colleagues, your social circles, and your precious community. Unless you back off and stay out of my life, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Mary Beth's face turned pale, her usual confidence replaced by fear. Chris stood, towering over them. "Consider this your only warning," he said firmly. "Stay away from me, my family, and my daughters. We're done." Without waiting for a response, Chris turned and walked away, leaving them stunned and silenced. This chapter, at least, was closed. Chris sat at the oak desk in his lawyer's office, his hands resting on the polished surface. The air smelled faintly of leather and paper, and the sound of a pen scratching across legal documents seemed louder than it should have been. This was the moment he had dreaded, but also the one he had worked toward with growing clarity. Signing the papers that would end his 25-year marriage felt both like a defeat and a liberation. As he lifted the pen, a swirl of memories flashed before him. Their wedding day, the birth of their daughters, family vacations filled with laughter. But those moments were now overshadowed by Amy's betrayal. The trust and respect that had once defined their relationship were irreparably shattered. Chris took a deep breath, steadied his hand, and signed his name. Later that evening, Amy came to the house, her face drawn and tear-streaked. She had been calling and texting for days, pleading for a chance to talk, and now, finally, Chris had agreed. They sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room, the space between them feeling wider than ever. "Chris," Amy began, her voice trembling, "I know I've made mistakes, terrible ones, but we've been together for so long. We've built a life, a family. Can't we find a way to fix this? I'll do anything." Her words hung in the air, but Chris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, noting the desperation in her eyes and the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. There was a time when he would have done anything to ease her pain, to reassure her. But now, he saw her differently, not as his partner, but as someone who had chosen to destroy the bond they had once shared. "Eh?" he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I've spent weeks trying to understand what happened, why you did what you did. I've questioned myself, our marriage, and every decision I've ever made. But the one thing I've realized is that this isn't about what I did or didn't do. It's about you and the choices you made." Amy's tears began to fall more freely. "I was stupid," she said, her voice breaking. "I got caught up in something that never should have happened. But it didn't mean anything, Chris. You mean everything to me." Chris shook his head, his expression resolute. "It may not have meant anything to you, but it meant everything to me. It meant breaking the trust we built over decades. It meant disrespecting our family, our daughters, and me. And trust? Trust doesn't come back." Amy reached out, her hand hovering near his. "But I can earn it back," she pleaded. "I'll go to therapy. We'll go to therapy. I'll prove to you that I can change." Chris leaned back, putting distance between them. "Do you even hear yourself, Amy?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You want me to give you the chance to prove something that should never have been in doubt. I can't live like that, wondering, doubting, waiting for the next betrayal. That's not a marriage. That's a prison." Amy sobbed quietly, her head bowed, but Chris pressed on, his voice softening slightly. "I loved you, Amy. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it away. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but because it's the truth. I can't rebuild what's been destroyed, not when the foundation itself is gone." For a moment, the only sound in the room was Amy's quiet crying. Chris felt a pang of guilt, not for his decision, but for the pain it caused. Still, he knew this was the right path. He had spent too long questioning his worth, doubting himself, and trying to salvage something that was unsalvageable. "I've filed for divorce," he said finally, his tone even. "The papers are with my lawyer. You'll get them soon." Amy looked up, her face stricken. "Chris, please," she whispered. "Think about the girls. Think about us." "I am thinking about the girls," Chris replied firmly. "They deserve parents who are honest and respectful, even if we can't be together. They'll see us co-parenting, but I won't show them a broken marriage and call it love." Amy's shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. Chris stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Amy," he said quietly. "But it won't be with me." As he watched her leave, Chris felt an odd mixture of sorrow and relief. The weight of the past weeks of suspicion, confrontation, and heartache was finally lifting. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time he felt a sense of control over his own life. In the days that followed, Chris began to rediscover himself. The pain was still there, but so was a growing sense of clarity. He spent more time with Julie and Kate, reaffirming his commitment to them. He leaned on Stacy and found comfort in her unwavering support. And he started to see his future, not as a broken man, but as someone ready to rebuild. The decision to end his marriage wasn't just about leaving Amy behind. It was about choosing himself, his dignity, and a life where trust and respect weren't negotiable. Chris had found his strength, and he wasn't going to let it go. The lakeside property greeted Chris with a serene silence that felt like a balm to his weary soul. The house, modest but welcoming, sat nestled among tall pines that whispered in the breeze. The lake stretched out before him, its surface smooth and shimmering under the afternoon sun. Each ripple on the water seemed to carry away a fragment of the pain he had been holding onto for so long. In the mornings, Chris found himself drawn to the porch, coffee in hand, as the world slowly awakened around him. The soft calls of loons echoed across the lake, and the gentle lapping of water against the dock became a rhythm he welcomed. For the first time in months, he felt the heaviness in his chest begin to lift. The tranquility of the lake was more than just a backdrop. It was a reminder that healing, though slow, was possible. Amy, meanwhile, began attending therapy sessions in the city, her efforts to rebuild herself marked by both progress and setbacks. She reached out to Julie and Kate frequently, but their responses were measured, cautious. Though Amy expressed regret and a desire to mend their bonds, the trust she had broken with her daughters was not easily repaired. Still, Chris encouraged them to keep the door open, reminding them that forgiveness was a gift they could give themselves as much as their mother. As the weeks passed, Chris immersed himself in the simple joys of his new life. He began restoring the small garden by the lake, finding unexpected peace in the dirt beneath his fingers and the fresh blooms that emerged under his care. Each step forward felt like a reclamation of himself, a rebuilding of the man he had once been, now stronger and wiser. On clear nights, he sat by the fire pit he had built, watching the flames dance against the dark expanse of the lake. The stars above seemed brighter here, as if offering him hope for the path ahead. For the first time, Chris allowed himself to dream of a future untethered by betrayal, where he could live with purpose and peace. The pain was still there, but so was a quiet growing hope. The soft hum of laughter filled the air as Chris and his daughters Julie and Kate sat on the dock by the lake, their feet dangling over the edge. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the water, reflecting the warmth that was beginning to return to their relationship. Julie teased her younger sister about an old childhood habit, and Kate retaliated with mock indignation. Chris smiled, content to simply watch them reconnect, not just with each other, but with him. The rift caused by the divorce was healing, their shared time becoming a bridge back to a stronger bond. At family gatherings, Chris continued to navigate the delicate balance of supporting both his parents and in-laws. During a summer barbecue at his lakeside home, Frank and Eileen sat quietly under a canopy, their expressions tinged with regret, yet softened by gratitude for Chris's efforts to maintain their connection. His parents, ever the optimists, joined him in ensuring the gatherings felt less like fractured moments and more like threads of unity. Even amidst the complexities, there was a sense of renewal. The shimmering lake and the gentle rustle of trees mirrored the gradual return of harmony. Chris felt hope, a steady rhythm in the backdrop of his rebuilding life, guiding them all toward a new, more resilient normal. Lucy's life after the divorce began as a quiet rediscovery of herself. Moving into a charming cottage just a few blocks from her parents' home, she found solace in the cozy space filled with sunlight and fresh blooms from her garden. The mornings became her sanctuary. She'd sip coffee on the porch while watching her children play in the yard, their laughter a reminder of the joy still present in her life. Slowly, the wounds of betrayal began to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. With time, Lucy poured herself into her career, excelling as a marketing consultant for a boutique firm. Her confidence grew with each successful project, and her colleagues admired her tenacity and grace. She often ended her work days with a brisk walk along the river near her neighborhood, the sound of rushing water echoing her growing sense of clarity and strength. One evening at a friend's dinner party, Lucy met Daniel, a kind and thoughtful architect with an easy smile. Their connection was immediate, built on shared values and a love for life's simple pleasures. Over the months, their relationship blossomed. Lucy's children adored him, and his presence brought a steady warmth to her once fractured world. Now, Lucy's days are filled with light and laughter. Her home is no longer a refuge, but a celebration of the life she has rebuilt. As she looks out over her flourishing garden, hand in hand with Daniel, she knows she's found not only happiness, but a profound sense of peace and fulfillment. Lucy's journey, though marked by pain, has led her to a place of hope and unshakable resilience. Stacy's office in Dallas reflected her growth. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, and the sleek desk bore signs of a woman in charge, neatly stacked reports, a fresh cup of coffee, and a small framed photo of her children. As the newly appointed Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing, Stacy thrived in her demanding role, her sharp intuition and natural leadership earning her respect from colleagues and clients alike. Yet, amidst her professional success, she never lost her grounded, approachable nature. Even from miles away, Stacy remained a steady presence in Chris's life. Their weekly calls often started with updates about work, but inevitably drifted into moments of shared humor and reflection. "You know," Stacy said during one such conversation, "if you ever need a break from your idyllic lakeside life, I've got plenty of chaos to keep you busy here." Chris laughed, the sound genuine and light. "I think I'll stick with my peace and quiet for now. But thanks for the offer." In her rare moments of solitude, Stacy often reflected on her journey, her past mistakes, her resilience, and the wisdom she had gained. The view from her office, with the city skyline stretching to the horizon, reminded her of the distance she had traveled, both literally and metaphorically. Stacy's life was a testament to growth, balance, and the joy of finding purpose even after heartbreak. The evening air buzzed with the hum of conversation and clinking glasses at the backyard party of a mutual friend. Chris wasn't expecting much, just a chance to unwind and enjoy a few familiar faces. Yet, as he stood by the grill, balancing a plate and a beer, he noticed Aggie. She was laughing with a small group, her vibrant red hair catching the glow of the patio lights. They had met briefly years ago at a family event, but tonight she seemed to radiate a warmth that drew him in. "Chris Harrington," Aggie greeted with a broad smile as she approached. "It's been ages." "Too long," Chris replied, matching her smile. "How've you been?" Their conversation flowed easily, a mix of light-hearted banter and genuine connection. Aggie's sharp wit kept him laughing, and her sincerity made him feel at ease. By the end of the evening, they exchanged numbers, and over the next few weeks, casual chats turned into meaningful discussions, then into dinner dates. Aggie brought a lightness to Chris's life that he hadn't felt in years. She had her own scars and stories, but carried them with resilience and humor. Together, they found a balance, sharing both laughter and quiet moments by the lake. For Chris, this budding relationship wasn't just about romance. It was about discovering that joy and stability were possible again. On a quiet morning, Chris sat by the lake, the water reflecting the soft hues of dawn. The stillness gave him space to reflect, and his thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him here. His marriage, once the foundation of his life, had been built on love and trust. But its end had taught him the fragility of those foundations when respect was lost. In the past 10 years, his marriage had declined slowly. Chris thought about the lessons he had learned. "Respect yourself," Stacy had told him during one of their early conversations, and those words had stayed with him. He realized that self-respect wasn't just about standing firm in the face of betrayal. It was about choosing to move forward without bitterness. The betrayal had broken him, but the process of rebuilding had revealed a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He also thought about resilience, the ability to weather life's storms and emerge, not unscathed, but wiser. It had taken time, patience, and no small amount of pain. But Chris had discovered that recovery wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it, using the lessons learned to shape a better future. Finally, Chris reflected on his daughters. They had been his anchor, the reason he kept pushing forward even on the hardest days. The bonds he had strengthened with Julie and Kate were a testament to the power of love and commitment, even in the face of heartbreak. As the sun rose higher, Chris smiled. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full of possibility. He and Amy remained cordial, their interactions centered around their daughters. Their paths had diverged, but there was peace in knowing they had each found their own way. With Aggie by his side, his career thriving, and his family relationship stronger than ever, Chris felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but he also knew he had the strength to face them. The ripples on the lake mirrored his thoughts, ever moving, yet always returning to stillness. Chris had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about embracing life with open arms, scars and all. For the first time in years, he felt truly whole.